Good afternoon. I sit here to introduce Rachel Clarke, and in doing so, I feel the weight of something much larger than words. She's written a book that is profoundly affecting in ways that I cannot enumerate. It's an unflinching account of a pediatric heart transplant, an account of how a life moves from one small body to another. It's Max and Kiera's story, two 9-year-olds, and she's written it as the biography of Kiera's heart from the moment it is in a car crash. So it's the story of the heart as it moves through time and space from the site of the car crash to intensive care, to operation theaters, to the aircraft, into other operation theaters, to the moment it's finally placed inside the chest of another small child. And we begin to see just how many people have to act correctly and quietly and sometimes anonymously for this journey to be completed. It is paramedics, nursing staff, physicians, surgeons, technicians, psychologists, coordinators, people who handle logistics, parents, siblings. There isn't one hero here. It's a chain of attention that has to be sustained through time. And Rachel has interviewed all the key individuals in this chain of attention that whose interventions enabled Kiera's heart to beat once again inside the child, inside the chest of another child. In the telling of this story, what she's also shown us is that the practice of medicine is fundamentally a human transaction that is sometimes conducted under tremendous pressure and is enabled by extraordinary acts of moral courage and kindness that are carried out by very ordinary people. So Rachel, thank you for being here. I'm absolutely honored to be in conversation with you. Tell us Kiera and Max's story.
Thank you very much, and I am thrilled to be here. So in 2017, Kiera, a little girl who was 9 years old at the time, was in a car crash. Her mother and little brother were in the car, and she suffered terrible catastrophic injuries, particularly brain injuries. And she was left in a deep coma in intensive care and was found to have no life in her brain. So she had suffered brain death, which meant she could potentially be an organ donor. And at the same time, another 9-year-old child called Max, a little boy in another part of the UK, was desperately ill on the transplant list, waiting for a heart transplant. There's a huge problem with a shortage of organs for transplantation, especially for children. And he'd been waiting for nearly a year for a heart. He was so ill, a virus had ravaged his heart muscle, and he was very close to death himself. And Kiera's heart proved to be a perfect match for Max. So a whole series of incredibly intricate medical procedures were initiated involving hundreds, probably thousands of National Health Service NHS staff, and they culminated with extraordinary choreography over the course of 2 days in Kiera's heart, traveling, as you say, across time and space and saving the life of Max. And I was captivated by this story because on the one hand, it seemed to me to showcase medicine at its absolute finest. Here was a group of many, many doctors, surgeons, nurses, paramedics working together to make this extraordinary feat happen. But it was also fundamentally an act of radical human altruism. At the heart of every successful transplant is a grieving family who have been plunged suddenly in the hardest circumstances a family ever has to face. And in the midst of that distress, their profound shock and grief, they make this decision to look outwards towards other people and gift their loved ones' organs so that they may save other lives. And I was fascinated by how the medical technology and the human altruism came together to save the life of Max.
Yeah, it's a remarkable story, and the thing about the heart transplant is that, particularly pediatric heart transplant, is that the triumph of that procedure is inseparable from the tragedy of that procedure. It's submitted to this kind of pitiless calculus. It's a zero-sum game. You know, some child has to die for another child to live. The happiness of a family is entirely built upon the worst day in the lives of another family. And it reminded me, there's a passage in your book that reminded me of a story written many years ago by Ursula Le Guin called Those Who Walk Away from Omelas. I don't know if any of you read this, but very briefly, it describes this city called Omelas, which is a city of pleasure and joy and happiness. And it describes a summer festival underway there. And by everybody celebrating, but by some mechanism that isn't quite explained, there's a child that is underground in the basement, is incarcerated. And all the pleasure in the city above is sustained by the misery of the child. And Le Guin describes it beautifully. She says, you know, the beauty of our skies, the abundance of our harvests, you know, the wisdom of our scholars, the health of our children, all of it is sustained by the abominable misery of the little suffering child. And I'll read a segment from Rachel's book, very briefly, where I could sense that. And this is when the transplant has happened and Max, the recipient, is back home. And he's actually sitting in his father's lap, this 9-year-old, and he goes to sleep placing his head on his father's chest. And it's a familiar scene anywhere, across families. But Rachel writes, this humdrum image has been sneaked past death and snatched from oblivion. And all that his son may go on to experience, the wash of the ocean, the smell of freshly cut grass, the thrill of the first kiss, the taste of mom's roast potatoes, all the myriad moments that make life worth living, will always and forever have been enabled by Chiara, who gave her heart to a dying boy so that he might, for a time, share its marching beat and bask in its boundless vitality. It's exactly the same moral arithmetic. What was it like to meet and interview Chiara's parents?
Well, I was really worried about approaching Chiara's family because this was such an clearly emotional, devastating event for them. And I very tentatively wrote to Chiara's mum and said, look, could I come to meet you to talk about this? And I decided from the outset that I would approach this writing project not with the ethics of a journalist. I needed to apply my ethics as a doctor to this project because it was so emotional, and if these families entrusted me with their story, I felt I needed to respect it and try to conduct myself with the same morality that I conduct myself as a doctor. And Chiara's mum and dad said, yep, we're very happy to meet you. And I remember sitting down in their living room, and it was extraordinary because here were Chiara's mum, dad, 2 sisters, brother, family dog, and an enormous cabinet at the back of the room that was a kind of shrine to Ciara. It was filled with her photos, the pictures she'd painted as a child, her horse riding hat, her rosettes that she'd won in gymkhanas, all of this kind of memorabilia celebrating the life of this little girl that had died. And here we were talking about the events leading up to the crash, everything that had happened since. And to my surprise, instead of being overburdened with grief, Ciara's mum and dad were beaming with pride, and they kept talking about the pride they felt towards Ciara because she had done something astounding. She had given 4 organs that saved the lives of 2 adults and 2 children. And she had ended up changing legal history in the UK. We now have a law in Britain that is called Max and Ciara's Law that has changed the legal circumstances around how we donate organs in the UK to encourage higher numbers of donations. And I realized something incredible in that moment when I talked to her parents. It was that as human beings, even in the most heart-wrenching circumstances a human being can face, and losing your child is just such a set of circumstances, even in those difficult circumstances, we, as human beings, have the capacity to find the beauty and meaning and significance in those tragedies. And it's something I see as a palliative care doctor over and over and over again. And the room was filled with that meaning and filled with the most astonishing kind of living, breathing love for Ciara and pride for Ciara. So it wasn't only a sad story for her parents. They were celebrating the life of their little girl. And I found that extraordinary. And the other thing that was extraordinary was the speed with which they said, yes, we want to write this book with you. We want you to tell Ciara's story. Tell it to the world. Do good with our daughter's story. Get audiences like you, this audience today, get them thinking about transplantation, get them talking to their families about whether or not they would gift an organ. And all of that was a chain of positive events that had come from a tragedy. And there's something beautiful about that.
Why don't you read out a passage from the book, and then perhaps tell them the story of, because there is meant to be complete anonymity about the identity of the deceased donor, but the family, Ciara's family, had some sense of who was the recipient for Ciara's heart, and there was a Facebook message that went out. So first, why don't you read the passage and then tell them the story of how Ciara's mum reached out?
Yes. Well, maybe I'll do it the other way around. I'll tell the story first and then read the passage. Usually it's very important that a donor family does not meet the recipient family, and that is really to protect everyone involved. It's very hard to predict what the emotional consequences may be for those families if they end up meeting. But in this particular case, there was a big campaign in the UK to change the law around organ donation, and Max ended up being part of the campaign. He and his family agreed that his story could be told in a newspaper to encourage people to think about organ donation. So his face appeared on the front page of a British newspaper, The Mirror. And then, after his life had been saved by Ciara's heart, another front page story appeared, and this time Max looked, instead of looking very close to death, he looked beautifully alive, pink-cheeked, healthy. And Kira's mum happened to see these stories and realised that almost certainly Kira's heart had saved Max. They were two children, the same age, the timing worked. And she found Max's mum on Facebook, on social media, and sent her a message. And the message simply said, "I think your son may have our daughter's heart, and it's the most beautiful heart in the world." And that was how she first contacted Max's mum. They communicated, they ended up meeting, and then a final story appeared on the front page of the Mirror newspaper. And this time, it was a photo from a moment when the two families met for the first time. And when they met, somebody had a stethoscope in the room, and one by one, Kira's mum, dad, brother and sisters listened with that stethoscope to her heart beating inside the chest of this beautiful little boy whose life she had saved. And that moment, when I read that story, was the moment when I wanted to write the book. I thought that's one of the most beautiful stories you could ever hear. And the extract I'll read is about Kira's sisters who were with her in intensive care when these terribly difficult discussions were happening around organ donation. And everybody tends to assume that for children, talking about death, dying, transplantation, this is all too difficult for a child to understand. Actually, her siblings, her two sisters, understood exactly what was happening, and I'll just read this extract. So at the time, Kira's two sisters were aged 11 and 13, and they've just arrived in the hospital. Both girls are desperate to see Kira. They rush into her room, effusive, and clamber into bed with their little sister. "Bob," exclaims Caitlin, who's 11. "Bob, we're here." The nickname stands for Bob-a-Lob-a Ding Dong, and no one in the family can quite remember its origin, except that it's somehow linked to Kira's passion for singing. The girls cover her shoulders with a fluffy white cardigan, tuck her favourite cuddly dog under her arm, and prop a phone against her pillow, from which her favourite song blares out on repeat. They chatter unstoppably about hair, nails, horses, music, exactly as though it is a conversation all three of them are sharing. They soften Kira's lips with strawberry lip balm and gently elevate her hands in turn, painting each nail a dazzling shade of orange. Finally, with the easy skill that comes from much practice, they adorn her fingers with Haribo gummy rings, more highly prized than diamonds when you're only 9 years old. As Keely and Caitlin lavish care and attention on their unconscious sister, it would be easy to assume from their laughter, exuberance, and ceaseless chatter that they're simply too young to understand the gravity of her injuries, but that would be to do them a disservice. For their efforts, almost frenzied, to treat Kira as a living, loving, conscious sister, stem not from naivety, but from its opposite. Their eyes dart and rove as they monitor the nurse's every word and gesture. They listen, grasp and absorb it all, the bleak and unforgiving facts of the matter. Even though there were 10 of us in Kira's room at one stage, I kept looking all the time at Kira, says Keely. I kept hoping I'd noticed something that the doctors had missed, some little thing that showed she wasn't brain dead, and I could tell them. Caitlin is equally circumspect. If anyone was paying attention, they would have spotted her fingers laid firmly and unwaveringly upon her sister's chest. Earlier, Caitlin overheard a nurse telling Joe, Kira's father, that her heart could stop beating at any moment. Ever since, she's kept her hand in position, attuned to the cadence of Kira's ribs against her palm. poised to sound the alarm should that rhythm falter. It's an act of consuming vigilance. But if I didn't do it, says Caitlin, I thought her heart might stop and nobody else would realise. Far from being ignorant of her sister's fragility, Caitlin is doing all she can to keep her alive. Never underestimate the clarity and intelligence of a child in a hospital. Throughout that Monday, Keely and Caitlin cuddle and talk to and pamper their sister, not out of innocence, but precisely because it's intolerable to imagine the world without her in it.
That is beautiful. It kind of makes you moist. But I've always wondered about families being asked to donate the organs of their children. And with pediatric cases, there's almost a 50% or more refusal rate. In India, in the UK, as Rachel mentioned, there's an opt-out policy now. But in India, we have no such thing. And I've often wondered that families are being asked to take such an important decision at perhaps the worst time psychologically, when they're at the end of their endurance. And one can perfectly understand the cause for their refusal. It isn't malice, it isn't cruelty, it's just that they're at the end of their tether and they don't even know what brain death means, and they're unable to square it with a beating heart and warm limbs. But I don't think we wish to sermonize at all, but it wouldn't be a bad idea for all of you to go and pledge your organs. And also, perhaps if there are creative people here, to try and find out how you can normalize pledging of organs as the default setting. Because if a family is being asked to do this after brain death, there'll always be refusals. So there has to be a pre-grief normalization that this is the only way to do it. This is a default setting. I've often wondered, in changing rooms and wherever there's a mirror, if you could have, something written under it saying this person can save 8 lives, and a QR code that links directly to the National Authority for Pledging of Organs. But in spite of the chronic dysfunction of the NHS, in the book, it comes across as this great moral engine. And you mention repeatedly the enormous kindness of everybody who was involved in such a case. In medicine, do you think kindness is a personality trait, or do you think it's a discipline, or both?
So I believe very, very strongly that the fundamental reason why anybody goes into a health service in any capacity, whether it's to train as a doctor, a nurse, a physiotherapist, is almost always very simple. It is a desire to help other people, people who are vulnerable because they are ill, because they have a problem with their health. And that's a really simple, pure instinct. It may be it may be distorted by other motives. People may think, well, it's I'm going to be wealthy if I become a doctor, but you're very unlikely to be a happy or frankly good doctor if that's your core motivation. And in the UK, going into the NHS is not a smart way to get rich. It's a smart way to get very, very tired. So the fundamental driving force of healthcare, of medicine, is this simple human instinct to reach out towards our fellow members of humanity and help them. So kindness is absolutely the core of medicine. The problem is the conditions of work in every health service, and I've been hearing very interesting stories about how difficult conditions can be in India, and they're difficult in the NHS as well. drive out that instinct, that the kindness that makes people want to become doctors in the first place. So if you have 5 minutes to see a patient and you have one patient after another sort of coming through the conveyor belt of your clinic or your emergency department, it is very, very hard to maintain your compassion and your humanity. And patients are acutely aware of that. I'm sure there are many people in this room who have had that experience of a doctor who very clearly wants to get you out of the room as quickly as possible. I've certainly had that experience myself. And I really don't think that's because doctors are inherently, or they're cruel or callous or dismissive of patients. It's to a large extent because the conditions of the job drive out those instincts that make you become a doctor in the first place. And I think that we all should work very, very hard to address this issue and ask ourselves as a profession, how do we maintain the vital humane instincts that make patients feel cared for? That's not a luxury add-on. Every encounter you have as a patient with a doctor should be one in which you feel cared for. And that means simply the clinician in front of you pays attention to you, they listen to you, they hopefully smile at you, they engage with you. These are really simple, easy things to do with a patient, and so often you will hear patients describe the opposite. Sometimes in the busy hospital where I work, I will go and see a patient who maybe is in the emergency department, and I will ask them how they are, I'll chat to them briefly, I'll take 2 minutes to explain what's happening, and sometimes that patient, they may be male or they may be female, they start to cry with gratitude, and they'll say, you're the first person who has actually explained to me what's going on, and that's heartbreaking. And I think it's a crisis of modern medicine that is easy to fix. It requires different training, it requires prioritizing, teaching the importance of humanity in healthcare. And this isn't expensive. This isn't like some incredible, fancy new AI technology. This is about going back to basics and saying, who are we in the medical profession? What are we trying to do for patients? If our patients do not feel as though we care about them, we're doing something fundamentally wrong. And the converse of that is true. If you show a patient you care about them, that they're not alone, that they may be frightened, but you are walking through this with them, that's a superpower. That can be transformative for a patient, and it's a wonderful way to help, which is what we all want to do in medicine. So I am a champion for kindness in medicine. I think its lack is a crisis in medicine that we should do everything in our power to fix.
Also, you specialize in palliative care. Palliative care is when you've given up on the consolation of cure, and you've accepted that the body will lose, and you ask the only remaining intelligent question, which is that how shall you lose? What, according to you, is the final obligation of medicine?
I think there is a very simple but maybe profound answer to that question. There is only one job for medicine, for doctors, and that job is to help our patients live their lives as richly and fully and meaningfully as possible on their own terms, not our terms as the doctor. The doctor's agenda is not the important agenda. There is only one boss in the room, and the boss is the patient. And what matters to the patient is the only important question. And this applies whether we are in palliative care, cardiology, psychiatry, every medical specialty. There is only one question. How can I, as a doctor, enable you to live your life as richly, healthily, and perhaps as long as possible on your terms? And so the only way to do that job properly is to take as your starting point what matters to the patient. Too much medicine is driven by other agendas. It's driven by our agenda as clinicians. Doctors are still, even in 2026, very bad at adopting a patriarchal approach to their patients. I know best, I am your doctor, I am going to do this thing to you because I think this treatment is in your best interests. We should never, ever approach a patient like that. The starting point should be to find out what matters to the patient. So an example of this in practice in palliative medicine is when I will maybe encounter a patient who has spent the last year of their life having relentless cycles of chemotherapy for cancer. And they have felt terrible during that year. They've lived, they've been alive for that year, but it's been a real ordeal. And I will sit down and chat to them about what that year's been like, and I will ask them how they feel about having more chemotherapy. I won't say, right, let's book you in for the next cycle next week. I'll say, how do you feel about having more? And they may be very hesitant about asking that question. But if you ask it in good faith, you may find the patient saying, I just don't know if I want any more. I'm wondering about whether or not I just stop having the chemo and I enjoy however much time I have left, even if it's a short amount of time, not in hospital, not having chemo, but at home with my family, who I love to bits and want to spend some time with. Once you open up that conversation, you are a team with the patient and you're working with them. So the first and last imperative in medicine is acting in your patient's best interests. And the only way you can do that is by finding out what matters to your patient. It is not a technological question. It's a question of meaning and emotion and significance, what is important in the patient's life. And medical school should start with that. Every first lecture that medical students ever have should include this point, because it's the core of medicine.
We'll throw this open to the audience, so if there are questions. Yes, the gentleman.
Okay. I don't need a mic. Yeah. This is perhaps a nerdy question. Ambarish said it's a zero-sum game, one life lost, one life gained. But in this particular case, you suggested that there were several organ donations from Kera. And so I want some sort of sense of statistics from you, that from a typical organ donor, how many lives are saved?
Yes, and this is a very good point. You're quite right. Actually, the arithmetic of transplant is not one-to-one. So one single organ donator can save up to 9 lives. And that's because many different organs can be shared. So 2 kidneys, 1 liver that can be divided up and go to 3 or 4 people, a heart, 2 lungs, even other parts of the body like the intestine, the pancreas. So type 1 diabetes, which radically shortens somebody's life, now can be treated with a transplant of a pancreas. So it's really extraordinary, because one single organ donor potentially saves the lives of 9 individuals, adults or children. And I think that's one reason why I would so encourage everybody to have this conversation. Most people, and nearly all children, when you ask them if they would want to be a donor, say yes. When I asked my own kids when they were little, how they felt about this. My son was incredibly angry that I even asked him the question. He looked at me with disgust and said, "Why are you even asking me that? Of course I want to be a donor." And it's an extraordinary thing to do. We all are mortal. We all wonder what our legacy will be on this earth. Have we made a difference? Have we done something good with our lives? Did we fill the lives of other people with love? Can we feel the comfort of knowing our life was meaningful? So one of the ways your death can be spectacularly meaningful is by gifting your organs, because you are giving the literal gift of life. You are committing a death-defying act with the act of organ donation. So please ask your families how they feel. Tell them how you feel, because no one wants a tragedy to happen, but if it does, much better to know their wishes.
Yes, indeed. And I think it's important, particularly considering the law in India, that even after you've pledged your organs, your family has the right to refuse organ donation.
And in the UK as well, yes.
So I think it wouldn't be a bad idea if you pledge your organs, just send a WhatsApp message on your family group that you have, and that your wish should be honored. The gentleman there, please.
There's no law for active euthanasia. Now that prevents me from giving a living will, saying that when I'm almost terminally end of my road, my organs should be taken out and I should be, euthanasia, and my organs should be transplanted. Now if that law was there, that would, my living will would help my family and the people, to take my organs when I'm almost at the end of the road. So that's one thing which is missing. I don't know whether Terry Pratchett is an author for children's books in England. He had a movement for active euthanasia. I don't know whether the law has come into being. In India, we have a passive euthanasia where I can give a living will, saying that my medical treatment should come to an end when a board of doctors say that, well, there's nothing much to go on. So that is there, but an active euthanasia law would really help in people. Incidentally, I must tell you, there's a monument here in Jaipur at the tri-junction of 3 major roads, a monument to the transplant donors here in Jaipur, and there's a big movement for organ donation, and people are coming. But pledging an organ is one thing, but getting it carried out by the family and by the doctors is a different thing. So there's a little gap there. And there's one more question I want to ask, please. I'm so sorry I'm going on. I read a book a couple of years ago, whether the donors and the donee should the families know about them. Here, I think we are allowed to tell people whom the donor is and who the donee is. But I think in UK, probably it's kept as a thing. In USA, it's not allowed, I think. So shouldn't that, your views on all these things, please. Thank you.
Okay, well, I'll answer the last of your questions. So should in fact the two families, the donor family, the recipient family, should it be normalized that they meet? And I think that the reason why we don't do that in the UK in the National Health Service is because of the principle in medicine of do no harm. It's really hard to predict emotionally, psychologically, the effect of these two families meeting. You just don't know how it will go. At its best, the two families will develop a relationship such as the one that Max and Kira's families have. So they are very close, they're still in contact. Kira's family are incredibly proud of the young man that Max has grown into. So Max is now 6 foot tall. He does martial arts. He's trying to join the fire brigade, and he's 17 years old. He's just this wonderful, full of life teenage boy. But even there, it's hard because every time Kira's parents see Max, they're almost seeing a doppelganger of what Kira might have been. Every milestone that Max passes, he becomes a teenager, he turns sweet 16, he has a girlfriend, he does his exams, he leaves school, he gets a job. That is the life that Kira is not living, and so it's painful, it's hard to see Max living the life that was truncated for their daughter. And that's just one example of how these relationships can be emotionally very fraught. So I think in the UK, the principle is do no harm. We can't be certain it will be positive overall for families, so it's safer to not allow them to meet. And that's why they're kept apart. They never find out their identities.
Right. Last question, please. Anuradha. It's a very complex issue, sir. Nowhere in the world is that permitted, but we'll talk about that later. Right.
I wanted to know if it is harder for the donors when their loved one has donated a heart, because the heart is associated with so many other, it's the heart. So just that, whether it depends, on a kidney or a liver.
Yes, it's really fascinating. The heart is unlike any other part of the human body in the sense that it is freighted with so much symbolism and emotion and significance for us as people who are storytellers, who imbue objects with meaning. A toe, a big toe, a gallbladder, an ear. There's nothing terribly meaningful about those parts of the body, as we heard from that comment from the stage. But the heart, we cannot help but treat as the repository of the human soul. It is where our emotions live. If you think about the language we use to describe hearts, we will talk about our hearts sinking or soaring or bursting with love. The Oxford English Dictionary definition of heart runs to 15,000 words because we have so many metaphors to describe the heart. And the earliest heart transplants were very difficult for the donor families because they thought that perhaps their loved one's soul was going to cross into the body of the person who received the heart transplant. So the first ever heart transplant performed by Christian Barnard in 1967, the wife of the man who was receiving the donor heart said to Christian Barnard, the surgeon, "Will my husband still love me after he has his transplant?" Because she thought that perhaps, she genuinely thought he might not love her because he would now have someone else's heart. So this does create all kinds of interesting challenges for donor and recipient families, because although intellectually we know that the brain is where all these things reside, we can't help but feel as though emotionally perhaps the heart is where they belong. And that's partly because our emotions can be literally heartfelt. So if you're frightened, your heart literally races, it speeds up with the adrenaline. If you are nervous because you love somebody and you're meeting them on your second date, again, your heart will race because of all of that emotion. So the heart is inextricably linked with ideas of human emotion and human soul in a way that makes it unlike any other organ.
Right. Halfway through the book, I signed up. I pledged my organs.
Thank you. Glad
yes.
to hear that.
So you have to go to NATO, which is the National Organ and Tissue Transplantation Organization. They ask for your Aadhaar card, and they ask, there's a drop box, there's a tab which says name of the individual or organization that motivated you. And in that box I said Rachel Clarke.
Oh,
So
thank you.
this book has had, has been properly applauded, it's collected its prizes, but none of the applause comes close to accounting for how incredibly beautifully this is written. Ladies and gentlemen, Rachel Clarke.